We're speaking with Lee Carter, who is a current State House representative in the Commonwealth of Virginia and is running to be the next governor of Virginia. I think it's a good opportunity to distinguish yourself, not just from your current candidates, but from your current governor, who's also a Democrat, Governor Northam. So if you could talk about what are the things that he has done that you do think need improvement upon and you will do differently than he has done over the past several years.
Well, the single biggest thing is economic development, right? This is where the bipartisan consensus in Virginia is on economic development. And, you know, the current economic development programs were started by former Governor McAuliffe, who is one of my opponents in this primary. And Governor Northam has continued them. But what they mean by economic development is just taking tens and hundreds of millions of dollars and using that money to try to bribe massive corporations to come in from out of state. And please, pretty please, will you give us some jobs? And they keep, you know, cramming these corporate headquarters like Amazon HQ2 and Nestle and IKEA and Volvo, and they cram them into the same handful of localities over and over and over again. And, you know, that causes people to come in from out of state. It drives up housing prices. And, you know, on paper, it looks like the economic conditions for the people in those localities is improving. But in reality, it's just replacing the people in those localities with newer, richer people from out of state. And then the folks who, you know, grew up in Arlington, they got to move out to Fairfax because they can't afford Arlington anymore. And then 5 years later, they got to move out here to Manassas because they can't afford Fairfax anymore. And then eventually they live in Fauquier and Stafford, and they're still working in DC and driving an hour and a half each day. And that's if there's no traffic, which there never is. Right. So instead of continuing down that path of cramming more and more out-of-state corporations into these small handful of places, instead of begging billionaires to come in and pretty please give us some jobs, we're going to take that money and we're going to put it into the hands of working Virginians. And we're going to say, this is your startup capital. This is the money that you're going to need to create your own employee-owned enterprise. You own it. You control it. You know, when the next crisis hits, it's not going to be a case where, you know, 8 executives in a boardroom in New York are deciding whether or not you get to eat. It's going to be you making the decision of what to do with the money. You get to look out for the bottom line, and you're not going to vote to lay yourself off. So, you know, not only do we solve a lot of the problems of our current economic development system, but we also, by rebuilding in a way that's worker owned, we create resiliency against the next crisis. Because, you know, these crises, the problem always comes when these companies say, we need to look out for the bottom line. And that means firing 40,000 people. But, you know, if it's the 40,000 people who would be fired that are making the decision of how to cut expenses, their own families are not going to be the expense that they cut.
No, I mean, ultimately what we're talking about, these are companies that are more concerned with their shareholders than with their employees. And so ultimately that's going to benefit everybody that's not in the state of Virginia, just as much as it's going to benefit a handful of people that may get employed that are in the state of Virginia. So it's really, there's a lot of money that's leaving your state and not benefiting your state. So it's unnecessary.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, there are examples right now of what that looks like in the real world, right? You know, on the small scale, it could be a diner with a dozen people that live there. And every 2 weeks, after they clean the tables off, they lock the door, they bring out the balance sheet and the schedule, and they decide amongst themselves who works what hours and what they do with the money. On the large scale, you know, the largest worker cooperative in the world is the Mondragon Corporation. It was founded in Spain in the 1950s with a dozen people in a church basement. They now have, I think, 87,000 employee owners. They work in 90 some odd different countries, and they've never had a layoff. Through all the economic crises that we've been through in the last 65 or 70 years, they've never had a round of layoffs because their CEO has to run for re-election among the workers, right? And if you're hacking and slashing and firing to keep the bottom line intact, you know, you're not going to get reelected. So instead they tighten the belts, right? The cuts come from the top. The executives take a pay cut to keep other people on the payroll. And that's the sort of economy that we can have. We just need to have the political will to say, we are going to own our economy. Far off investors are not going to own this thing that controls our destiny anymore. It's going to be us.
So then what happens to unions?
So this is an interesting question. I am very, very pro-labor. I think that everybody—
I know. Well, as are we, but we're not always pro-union. Pro-union and pro-labor are often two different things, unfortunately.
Yeah. Unions, I think that everyone who works in an investor-owned workplace should have a union. Absolutely. Because that's your way of having some control over the decisions that are made. But it's really kind of veto control. It's not direct control. It's I think you've gone too far this time. So we're going to shut everything down until you reel it back in. Whereas when we talk about actual employee ownership, that's the employees or the representatives of the employees making the decisions from day to day. And, one way that you can frame that is essentially the union owns the shop, right? So you're not talking about like open shop versus closed shop. This is the union of all the workers, are the ones who actually hold the title. Right. They're the ones who control what goes in and what comes out. And so, it's a completely different dynamic from what people are used to thinking of when they think of a union, because, people are used to, the most power you can have is just that veto. But instead of having a veto over someone else's decision, I'd much rather have the working people of Virginia be the ones making that decision.
Yeah. Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.